And at that point, Philip, I'm going to hand over to you.
I'm going to keep it pretty brief so that Helen can say a few words. The whole question of creative work or creative labour has become really quite a key one in current cultural analysis. And I think what we've been concentrating on in this particular project is what's now called precarious work, the ways in which people strive to make a living and find it continually difficult to make a living and have to keep reinventing themselves in order to do so. And one of the intriguing questions that arose when you start with the legal framework and when you start with the framework of cultural policy is the extent to which those forms of work do not really intersect either with law very substantially or indeed with cultural policy. The questions that we started off with were really top-down questions, questions about what does the law cover and what kinds of intervention can policy make. And one of the really interesting areas that I think is going to be very productive for future research is the gap between those kinds of approach and cultural creative practice on the ground. What implications does this have for research, I suppose, is one of the consequences of this particular piece of research. We found, for example, that the research question shifted from thinking primarily about copyright to thinking about performers' rights, which was really quite a different terrain. We also encountered, in the context of the interviews that we did, a considerable distance, if you like, between the preoccupations and the rhetoric of policymakers and what artists are actually about. Now, they may sound really trivial, but I think in the context of a policy framework which we have both in Scotland and in the UK and which has become globalised, in which trying to get traction, if you like, out of creative work in pursuit of the greater good of the national economy, the failure to effect traction becomes a very considerable question. And I think also, and I'm sure that people will say this as the morning proceeds, that law seems really to deal with the benefits and rights of the successful 1%, and everyone else is pretty well out of the frame. There are really core strategies for governments and cultural and creative agencies that today, and one of them characteristically is upskilling people, making them better fitted for the market in a variety of ways, whether this is to do with how to run a business, how to market themselves, how to actually give some kind of substantive organisation to what they do. And then the legal framework, as Charlotte has pointed out, is very much focused on the question of how you incentivise production and also circulation of cultural commodities and how you protect rights holders. But the protection to rights holders is actually very partial. And if you take Ian Hargreaves' recent paper, The Digital Opportunity, which he wrote for the UK government, you'll find a very particular kind of vision of what constitutes a significant IP framework, which is meant to be helpful, but I think actually, in effect, is highly exclusionary. So one of the questions that for us has come out of this project and that we'd like to pursue in future is to what extent do policy and law really engage with the realities of creative practice on the ground, despite now more than a decade of sort of rhetorical commitment to that kind of engagement. And what if conditions on the ground are not directly shaped by the interventions of policy and law for most people? you then end up with somebody pulling a piece of string, as it were, with nothing at the end of it. And that's not what we normally talk about when we talk about creative industries policies, but it does seem to be quite a relevant point. I could give a number of examples, but I'll forbear so that Helen can come back and we'll stick to time. But what we found was, and this will be in the published work, and actually if you go and look at the interviews online, you'll see that it's there. In a cultural economy of low expectations, where people really collaborate with each other, they do it for fun, they do it perhaps in the expectation of future gain, but they don't do it in the expectation of making a lot now. Economic rationality really does not apply in the classic sense, and economic rationality is what really underlies a great deal of legal and policy thinking. And it seems that, at least from the point of view of the analysis of creative processes, we ought to be thinking, at least for the vast majority of people, much more in terms of gift relationships, or something like gift relationships, which are not innocent because people give gifts on the expectation of reciprocity. That's the way the thing works. But it's much more that sort of model than a model of maximizing returns, which seems to be relevant for policy thinking. And I'll just leave it there and over to Helen. I don't know if, Helen, if you want to come up here or you want to do it from there.
I'll just do it from here, if that's okay.
So.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I don't really know where to begin, actually. Something that Charlotte said about the relationship between the choreographer and the dancers, which is obviously I'm very interested in myself. But I've been trying to think of some kind of analogy in relation to that, because even although I wouldn't go down a line of a kind of copyright always holding for choreographers, if you like. But nevertheless, I'm thinking about, just in research terms, about the PI and the RA, for example, where, to begin with, the PI has it's the idea for the project, the mobilization of that project, and the RA comes into the project and then works in relation to that. And it can sometimes be the case that actually the research assistant feels that that project is theirs, and the PI feels that the project is theirs because they've kind of coordinated it and organized it, and it was their idea in the first place. So it might be about a relationship of thinking about the way in which choreographers work, is that they do have this kind of vision. You don't know exactly what that frame will look like or how it will be performed, if you like, in some way, but they have a kind of vision of where they want to go, and they will have their kind of signature movements, practices, and so forth, which are repeatable through that framework. So that may be one way in which actually we might want to consider that ownership lies mainly with the choreographer as opposed to the performer who comes into that, if you take that kind of relationship with that. I'm really interested about the gift relationship, Philip, and I think it would be nice to have you, if you could talk a little bit about, I'm thinking about Marcel Mauss stuff here, yeah. But it might be quite nice maybe to talk a wee bit about how that might work, if you like, or if you've thought about that.
Marcel Mauss rather than Mickey Mouse.
Marcel Mauss, yeah.